In the late autumn of 1943, on a windswept plain in rural Texas, Italian prisoners of war shuffled from the back of a canvas-covered truck into the unfamiliar chill of American custody. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass, a world away from the familiar smells of Mediterranean earth. The men, their faces etched with the grime of transport and the deeper exhaustion of defeat, moved with the mechanical obedience of soldiers who had lost their war. They had been told what to expect: brutality from the Americans, a people they understood only through the stark caricatures of propaganda. They anticipated barbed wire, starvation, and the casual cruelty of victors. The wire was certainly there, stretching in precise, geometric lines against a sky of impossible size and startling blue, but the rest remained an unknown, a void filled by their darkest assumptions. Sergeant Emilio Gallo, a man whose authority had been stripped away along with his rifle, kept his eyes fixed on the muddy ground. He counted the steps from the truck to the first wooden building, a habit of measurement that gave a small, false sense of control. Around him, the others did the same, their silence a shared shield. There was Vico, a boy of 19 from Naples who still looked for his mother in his sleep, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. And Benigni, the quiet Florentine, an artist who now saw only shades of gray and brown. They were a flock without a shepherd, driven by whistles and gestures from men in uniforms the color of dust. The American guards were tall and impassive, their faces unreadable beneath the brims of their helmets. They did not shout. They did not shove. Their orders were clipped, efficient, and devoid of the theatrical malice Gallo had been conditioned to anticipate. This absence of overt hostility was, in its own way, more unnerving than a blow. It was a blank page on which fear could write anything. The processing began in a long, narrow building that smelled of disinfectant and damp wood. The prisoners were lined up, their worn boots tracking mud onto the clean-planked floor. An American officer with a clipboard and tired eyes stood behind a simple trestle table, calling out names from a list. One by one, the Italians stepped forward, gave their name, rank, and number, the words feeling hollow and foreign in this new context. Gallo watched the procedure, his mind a fortress of suspicion. This was the overture. The methodical calm was a performance, a prelude to the real camp life that would begin once the formalities were over. He had seen it before, the way systems could be used to break men more effectively than any fist. He braced himself, a tension coiling in his gut. He instructed Vico with a glance to keep his head down, to show nothing, to be nothing more than a number on a list. The boy nodded, his eyes wide and dark. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of waiting. Each quiet command, each rustle of paper, seemed to amplify the silence of the prisoners. They were ghosts at their own reckoning, their pasts erased, their futures a terrifying, unwritten space defined by the will of these quiet, efficient men. The first act of their captivity was not violence, but paperwork. Their personal effects were taken next. Photographs, letters, a worn rosary. Each item was placed into a small cloth bag, tagged, and stored. They were being unmade piece by piece. Benigni watched his small sketchbook, filled with charcoal drawings of Sicilian landscapes, disappear into a sack. A flicker of pain crossed his face, the only sign of protest he allowed himself. Gallo surrendered a faded photograph of his wife, Elena, her smile a beacon from another life. He watched the American clerk handle it with a detached professionalism, logging it in a ledger as if it were a piece of equipment. There was no sneer, no triumphant glance. The process was impersonal, bureaucratic, and in that coldness, Gallo found a new kind of fear. It was the fear of being rendered insignificant, of being reduced to an inventory number in a vast, indifferent machine. As they were led from the administration building towards another, larger structure, the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows of the watchtowers across the compound. The shadows stretched like grasping fingers, and for a moment, the camp looked exactly like the place from the posters, a cage built to hold and to break. The men huddled closer together, their shared apprehension a meager warmth against the encroaching cold of the Texan evening. They had arrived. The gate had closed behind them. The unknown was about to begin. They were marched into a large, windowless building where the air was thick with the smell of carbolic soap and steam. This, they thought, was the place. The delousing. Here, the humiliation would be made physical. They were ordered to strip. The command was simple, delivered by a burly American sergeant whose face was a mask of bored duty. The Italians hesitated, a collective moment of defiance and shame. Then, slowly, they began to undress, folding their tattered uniforms into neat piles as if the discipline of the act could preserve some sliver of their dignity. Their bodies, pale and thin from weeks of poor rations and hard marching, were exposed to the cold air and the indifferent gaze of their captors. Gallo kept his eyes forward, focusing on a crack in the wooden wall, refusing to meet the eyes of his men. He felt the shame of their shared vulnerability, a nakedness that went deeper than skin. He expected jeers, mockery, the prodding of rifle butts. Instead, they were herded towards a series of shower heads from which gushed streams of shockingly hot water. The steam billowed around them, obscuring faces, softening the harsh lines of the room. For men who had not felt truly clean in months, the sensation was a physical shock, a violent comfort that was deeply confusing. The water sluiced away the dirt, the sweat, the clinging grime of the battlefield. It stung their cuts and soothed their aching muscles. Gallo stood under the spray, letting the water run over his head and down his back, his fists clenched at his sides. He fought the urge to relax, to surrender to the simple creature comfort of it. This was a trick, a way to soften them. He scrubbed at his skin with the coarse bar of soap they had been given, the motion angry and methodical. He was washing himself, but he was also trying to scrub away the disorientation that was beginning to seep past his defenses. After the showers, they were given rough linen towels. The fabric was coarse but clean and dry. As they dried themselves, a man in a white coat moved among them. He was not a soldier. He was older, with spectacles and gentle hands. A medic, Captain Hayes, his name tag read. He examined them one by one, his touch professional and firm. He checked for lice, for skin infections, for signs of dysentery or fever. He dabbed antiseptic on open sores and made notes on a chart. When he reached Vico, who had a festering cut on his arm, he cleaned it with practiced efficiency, his expression one of clinical concern. He spoke a few words in broken, halting Italian, learned from a book. "This needs dressing." Every day Vico stared at him, uncomprehending. The man was treating him not as a defeated enemy, but as a patient. The simple medical act was a profound disruption of the expected narrative of cruelty. When the examinations were done, they were led to a stack of clothing. Not prison stripes, but surplus American Army fatigues, dyed a dark, unremarkable blue. The fabric was stiff but whole, free of tears or stains. They were also given new undergarments and socks. Pulling on the clean, dry clothes was another small, disarming comfort. It was a restoration, not a degradation. They were being made clean, whole, and uniform, but in a way that felt less like punishment and more like an orderly reset. As Gallo buttoned the unfamiliar shirt, he felt the stiff collar against his neck. The clothes were anonymous, stripping them of their former identity as Italian soldiers. Yet they were also practical and warm. They were being equipped to survive the winter, not left to waste away. He looked at his men, their faces still wary, but the edge of raw fear had been replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. They had been prepared for a fight, for resistance, for enduring pain. They had not been prepared for this methodical, impersonal, and deeply humane efficiency. As they filed out of the building, the steam clinging to their hair and clothes, they carried the warmth of the water and the clean scent of soap back into the cold night air. It was a warmth that felt both welcome and profoundly dangerous. The mess hall was a long, low building filled with rows of trestle tables and benches, smelling of boiled potatoes and something savory. The prisoners filed in, their movements still hesitant, their eyes scanning the room for threats. They expected to be fed last, to be given the scraps, the dregs of the pot. Propaganda posters had shown them images of starving prisoners in Allied camps, their faces skeletal, begging for a crust of bread. Gallo positioned himself at the end of a bench, pulling Vico and Benigni down with him, ensuring they were not isolated. He watched as 2 American guards went through the line first, their trays filled from the same large vats the prisoners were now approaching. There was no special treatment, no separate, better meal for the captors. This small detail did not escape him. When it was his turn, a prisoner on kitchen duty, a German by his accent, ladled a thick, steaming stew onto his metal tray. It was filled with chunks of meat, potatoes, and carrots. Next to it, he was given 2 thick slices of white bread and a tin mug of a dark, hot liquid that smelled vaguely of coffee. The sheer quantity of the food was astonishing. It was more than he had seen in a single meal in over a year. He carried the tray to his seat, his movements careful, as if he feared it might be snatched away. He sat and stared at the stew, the steam rising to warm his face. He picked up the bread. It was soft and fresh. He broke off a piece and put it in his mouth. The taste was plain, simple, and utterly real. Around him, the other men were eating, some with a desperate, animal hunger, others with a slow, disbelieving caution. The only sounds were the clatter of spoons against metal trays and the low murmur of the American guards talking at their own table across the room. Gallo watched them. The guards ate the same food with the same apparent lack of ceremony. They were not gloating. They were not observing the prisoners' reactions. They were simply eating their dinner. This parody was the most radical act he had yet witnessed. It was not kindness, not in a sentimental sense. It was procedure. The rules of this place, it seemed, dictated that everyone ate the same meal. This simple, bureaucratic fact was a more powerful counterargument to the propaganda than any speech could have been. Propaganda dealt in emotions, hate, fear, superiority. This was about logistics. It was about caloric intake and the efficient running of an institution. And yet, the effect was deeply humanizing. To share a meal, even in silence, even across a divide of language and war, was to acknowledge a shared, fundamental need. Vico ate quickly, his eyes closed in a kind of bliss, the food a balm to his chronic hunger. Benigni ate slowly, methodically, as if he were studying the composition of the meal. Gallo ate with a deliberate pace, forcing himself to chew, to taste, to analyze the sensation. The stew was bland but nourishing. The bread was filling. The coffee substitute was hot and bitter. It was the meal of a soldier, a laborer, not a prisoner marked for starvation. He finished his portion and saw that some of the younger men were already looking around, their trays clean, their hunger still not fully sated after months of deprivation. An American Sergeant Miller, a man with a square jaw and watchful eyes, noticed their glances. He walked over to the serving vats, spoke briefly with the German cook, and then gestured to the Italian prisoners. "Seconds," he said, the single English word clear and unambiguous. A few of the Italians, emboldened, went back for another ladle of stew. There was no punishment, no trick. There was simply more food. Gallo remained seated, watching this quiet transaction. He felt a crack appear in the wall of his certainty. He had built that wall from fear and hate, from stories of enemy depravity. Now, a simple ladle of stew and a slice of bread were chipping away at its foundation. It was not a grand assault, but a slow, persistent erosion. As the men finished their meal and filed out of the hall, back into the cold dark, the warmth of the food lingered in their stomachs, a confusing, contradictory heat. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by bells and whistles, a structure that replaced the chaos of war and the uncertainty of transit. This routine was not the brutal, punitive labor they had been led to expect. It was work, organized and purposeful, that seemed aimed at maintaining the camp itself rather than breaking the spirits of the men within it. Reveille was at dawn, followed by a breakfast of porridge and the same bitter coffee substitute. Then the work details were assigned. Some men were sent to the laundry, a steamy, soap-scented building where they operated large, mechanical washing machines. Others worked in the kitchens, peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots alongside German prisoners, their shared task creating a temporary, unspoken truce. A third group, which included Gallo, was assigned to maintenance, repairing fences, fixing broken floorboards in the barracks, or tending to the camp's vital machinery. Gallo found himself working in the boiler room, a cavern of pipes and valves that supplied hot water to the showers and laundry. The man in charge was a civilian American, a foreman named Mr. Abernathy, who was well past military age, with hands permanently stained with grease and a perpetually weary expression. He did not speak a word of Italian, and Gallo's English was non-existent. Their communication was a language of gestures, of pointing, of grunts of approval or frustration. Abernathy was not interested in their status as prisoners. He was interested in their competence. He needed a valve replaced, a pipe sealed, a pressure gauge monitored. When he saw that Gallo, a former mechanic in Turin, understood the logic of the machinery, a flicker of professional respect entered his eyes. He would hand Gallo a wrench, pointing to a leaking joint, and Gallo would tighten it. There was a clean, simple satisfaction in the work, in the tangible result of a problem solved. The hiss of a sealed pipe, the steady hum of a well-functioning boiler. These sounds were a comfort, a reminder of a life where things could be fixed. One afternoon, they were tasked with repairing a section of the perimeter fence that had been damaged in a storm. The work was hard, physical labor under the vast, empty sky. They dug post holes in the hard-packed earth and stretched new lengths of barbed wire. Sergeant Miller supervised them, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his presence a constant reminder of their captivity. But he did not stand over them and shout. He sat on a crate watching, ensuring the work was done and that no one tried to make a run for the endless, flat horizon. The rhythm of the work took over. The thud of the post-hole digger, the metallic screech of the wire being stretched, the steady tapping of hammers against staples. Vico, working beside Gallo, began to hum a tune from his village, a simple, sad song. Miller looked over, his expression unreadable, but said nothing. The quiet humming continued, a small thread of their own culture woven into the fabric of their labor. This was the moral order of the camp. You worked, you were fed, you were sheltered. The system was predicated on utility, not cruelty. A broken fence was a security risk. A malfunctioning boiler meant no hot water, which bred filth and disease. A hungry prisoner was a weak and inefficient worker. The logic was cold, almost industrial, but its consequences were humane. By being made useful, they were kept healthy. By being kept busy, they were shielded from the corrosive idleness that could destroy a man's mind. Gallo observed this logic with a mechanic's eye. He saw the camp not as a tool of punishment, but as a complex machine designed for a specific purpose, to contain them with maximum efficiency and minimum trouble. This efficiency required a certain level of care for its components, the prisoners themselves. This realization did not make him feel grateful. It did not make him trust his captors. But it replaced his fear of arbitrary violence with a grudging respect for the cold, rational system that governed their lives. The discipline was not in whips or solitary confinement. It was in the morning bell, the neatly repaired fence, the steady rhythm of a hammer, and the shared, silent understanding that a job done well was its own small form of existence. One evening, after the week's work was done, the prisoners were assembled and marched not to the mess hall, but to a larger, barn-like structure that served as a recreation hall. A wave of suspicion rippled through the men. This was an unscheduled event, a break in the routine, and any deviation was a potential source of danger. They filed inside, the room dark except for a single cone of light emanating from a small window in the back wall. At the front of the hall, a large white sheet had been stretched taut, a makeshift screen. They were going to be shown a film. The consensus was immediate and grim. It would be propaganda. They would be forced to watch films of American military might, of Allied victories, of their own leaders portrayed as fools or monsters. It was another form of psychological warfare, a tool to demoralize them. Gallo found a seat on a back bench, his arms crossed, his posture a physical manifestation of his resistance. The men sat in silence as the last of them shuffled in. The guards, including Sergeant Miller, took up positions along the walls, their presence a silent order to remain seated and attentive. The lights in the hall were extinguished, plunging them into near-total darkness. The only illumination was the bright, flickering beam of the projector, alive with dancing dust motes, cutting a straight, unwavering path through the darkness to the screen. The machine whirred to life, its rhythmic clicking the only sound in the cavernous room. Then, music swelled, a grand, sweeping orchestral score, and images appeared on the screen. It was not a newsreel. It was not a documentary about the war. It was a Hollywood musical. On the screen, men and women in impossibly clean and stylish clothes were singing and dancing in the streets of a city that looked like a fairy tale. Their movements were graceful, their smiles effortless, their problems resolved with a catchy song. The prisoners watched in stunned silence. The sheer, unapologetic frivolity of it was baffling. It was a vision of a world without mud, without hunger, without fear. A world of pure artifice and escapism. At first, the men were rigid, their skepticism a palpable force in the room. This had to be a trick, a display of American decadence meant to mock their own suffering. But the film's relentless optimism was a strange and powerful force. Vico, sitting next to Gallo, let out a small, involuntary laugh at a scene of comedic dancing. A few other men chuckled. The sound was hesitant at first, then grew more confident. Gallo watched the screen, but he was more interested in watching his men. He saw their tense shoulders begin to relax. He saw the faint smiles appearing on faces that had been grim for months. They were being disarmed not by force but by fantasy. The film was in English and they could not understand the dialogue, but the story was told in the universal language of music, dance, and spectacle. It required no translation. It bypassed the intellect and went straight for a more fundamental human desire for joy and beauty. Benigni, the artist, was transfixed, his eyes tracing the elegant compositions of the scenes, the play of light and shadow. For 2 hours, they were not prisoners. They were simply an audience. The projector beam, cutting through the dust, seemed to be projecting more than just light. It was projecting a possibility, a memory of a life where such things as singing and laughter existed. When the film ended and the lights came up, the men blinked, adjusting to the sudden return to reality. The mood was lighter, changed. As they filed out of the hall, there was a low buzz of conversation, men trying to describe a favorite scene or humming a fragment of a tune. The shared experience had created a temporary bond, a brief respite from their isolation. Gallo walked in silence, his mind grappling with the paradox of what he had just witnessed. His captors had given them an evening of pure, unadulterated entertainment. It served no obvious strategic purpose. It was not indoctrination. It was a movie. He could not reconcile this act with the image of the brutal, soulless enemy he had been taught to despise. The projector beam, now extinguished, left a lingering image in his mind. A straight, bright line drawn through the darkness, connecting two disparate worlds, if only for a moment. The memory of the music and the dancing followed them back to the barracks, a strange and persistent echo in the quiet, disciplined night. Back in the relative privacy of the barracks, the fragile unity of the movie night dissolved into debate. The experience had unsettled the prisoners' carefully constructed worldview, and they retreated to familiar positions to make sense of it. The older men, the veterans of other campaigns, were the most cynical. "A trick," declared a corporal named Rossi, a grizzled man with a perpetually sour expression. "They show us their fantasy world, their women, their wealth. It is to make us soft, to make us envy them. It is to break our loyalty." He spat on the floor for emphasis. "They fatten the pig before the slaughter. They give us food, hot water, moving pictures. Why? Because a healthy, docile prisoner is less trouble than a sick, rebellious one. Do not be fooled by this performance of decency." Several men nodded in agreement, finding comfort in this familiar narrative of enemy cunning. It was easier to believe in a complex deception than in a simple, inexplicable act of humanity. Vico, however, was not convinced. His youth made him less anchored to ideology, more open to the evidence of his own senses. "But the food is real," he argued, his voice quiet but firm. "The medicine Captain Hayes gave me for my arm, it was real. No one was forced to enjoy the film. It was a gift. The word gift hung in the air, a radical and dangerous idea. To accept a gift from the enemy was to acknowledge a relationship beyond that of captor and captive. It implied a shared humanity that their training had explicitly denied. Rossi scoffed. A gift? A dog is given a bone to ensure its obedience. You are a fool, boy. You see kindness where there is only strategy. Gallo remained silent, listening to the arguments from his bunk. He lay with his hands behind his head, staring up at the wooden planks of the bunk above him. He understood Rossi's position perfectly. It was the soldier's logic, the prisoner's defense mechanism. To believe in the enemy's cruelty was to maintain one's own moral clarity. Kept the lines clear, the hate pure. But Gallo could not ignore the inconsistencies. He thought of the foreman, Abernathy, who cared only if a pipe was sealed correctly. He thought of Sergeant Miller, who had allowed Vico to hum his sad folk song while repairing the fence. And he thought of the film, an act of such profound non-military strangeness that it defied easy explanation. He did not believe it was kindness, not in the way Vico did. Vico saw a human heart behind the actions. Gallo saw a system, but the system itself was the puzzle. A system of control built on efficiency and order could have been designed to be cruel. It would have been just as effective, perhaps more so. Yet this one was not. It was dispassionate, methodical, and, in its outcomes, humane. Why? Was it a reflection of the American character? Was their entire nation built on this strange, paradoxical blend of detached procedure and baseline decency? He felt like an engineer staring at a machine whose purpose he could not quite fathom. He could see all the gears turning, the food, the work, the medicine, the entertainment, but the ultimate design, the blueprint of the creator's intent, remained elusive. Benigni, the artist, offered a different perspective. He sat on his bunk, sketching on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal he had found. "Perhaps it is not for us at all," he said softly, not looking up. The debaters fell silent, turning to him. "Perhaps," he continued, "they are not doing these things to change us. Perhaps they are doing them because this is who they are. An army, a nation must have rules. Their rules are different. We were taught their rules would be barbarism. We find instead they are bureaucracy. We expected a monster, but we have found a clerk." This observation, in its quiet simplicity, silenced the room. It reframed the entire experience. It suggested that the prisoners were not the primary audience for these acts. The Americans were performing for themselves, adhering to their own code, a code that happened to include provisions for the fair treatment of prisoners. The thought was both comforting and profoundly alienating. It meant they were simply cogs in a machine that was running according to its own internal logic, a logic they were never meant to understand. The debate died down, replaced by a thoughtful, uneasy silence. In his bunk, Gallo closed his eyes, the inner tension between what he had been taught and what he was experiencing creating a silent, grinding friction in his soul. The camp offered the prisoners the opportunity to write letters home. It was another scheduled, procedural event, governed by a strict set of rules. They were given a single sheet of thin paper and a small envelope once a week. The letters would be read by a censor, so they had to be careful. No military information, no complaints about their treatment, no expressions of despair that might be construed as anti-American propaganda. The act of writing, constrained as it was, became a powerful ritual. It was a link to a world that seemed increasingly distant, a way to affirm that they still existed, that they were still husbands, sons, and brothers. One evening, Gallo sat on his bunk, the thin sheet of paper spread on his knee, a borrowed pencil in his hand. A single lantern cast a pool of yellow light in the center of the barracks, its glow soft and warm against the surrounding gloom. Condensation traced patterns on the cold window panes. He wanted to write to Elena, to tell her he was alive and well, but the simple words felt inadequate. How could he describe this place? How could he explain the profound strangeness of his existence without violating the censor's rules or causing her to worry? He couldn't write. "I am fed better here than I was in my own army," he couldn't write. "My captors are not the monsters we were told they were. They are merely efficient and distant. Such truths would never pass the censor stamp. And even if they did, would Elena understand? So he wrote in code, not a military code, but a code of the heart. He wrote about the sky, how vast and empty it was. He wrote about the work, describing the satisfaction of fixing a leaky pipe, a simple, honest task. He wrote that the food was sufficient and the shelter adequate. Each sentence was a carefully constructed truth, designed to reassure while simultaneously expressing the deep sense of dislocation he felt. He was trying to describe the shape of the hole in his life without ever mentioning the hole itself. He looked around the barracks. Other men were hunched over their own letters, their faces illuminated by the lantern's glow, their expressions a mixture of concentration and sorrow. They were all engaged in the same delicate act of translation, trying to bridge the enormous gap between their reality and their families' imaginations. After he finished, he took his letter to the collection point, a wooden box overseen by an American officer. The officer took the unsealed envelope, glanced at it, and placed it on a stack. Next to the stack was a large, bound ledger. In this book, the name of each prisoner who sent a letter was recorded, along with the date. Gallo saw his own name there from the previous week. Gallo, Emilio, Sergeant. It was a record, a testament to his communication, his existence. He was an entry in a ledger, a name on a list, a letter awaiting a censor stamp. The entire system of communication was as orderly and impersonal as everything else in the camp. Later that night, unable to sleep, he thought about a different kind of ledger, the one in his own mind. He found himself replaying the moments of his capture, the faces of the young American soldiers who had disarmed him. They had been boys, not much older than Vico, their faces a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He remembered the long march, the feeling of defeat, the shame. And he thought about the men in his own unit who had not been captured, who had fallen in the dust of Sicily. He saw their faces, heard their voices. A quiet, gnawing guilt began to surface, a feeling he had suppressed for months. Why was he here, warm and fed, while they were gone? The question had no answer. He looked out the window at the dark compound, at the distant, steady light of a watchtower. The lantern in the barracks had been extinguished, and the men were asleep. But Gallo lay awake, the weight of his own unwritten ledger pressing down on him. The letters he wrote home were full of careful omissions, but the truth, he was beginning to realize, was something he would have to write for himself, in the silent, lonely ledger of his own conscience. The winter deepened, bringing with it a biting wind that swept across the flat Texas plains and found its way through every crack in the wooden barracks. The camp's large, central boiler, the heart that pumped hot water to the showers and laundry, began to fail. Its pressure was unsteady, and a strange, clanking sound echoed from its iron belly. Mr. Abernathy, the civilian foreman, was beside himself with worry. A complete failure would mean no hot water for hundreds of men in freezing temperatures, a crisis of hygiene and morale. He and his small team of American maintenance workers tinkered with it for a day. But the problem, a complex issue with a series of worn-out pressure valves deep within the system, was beyond their immediate grasp. Sergeant Miller, whose duties extended to general camp order, knew of Gallo's mechanical aptitude from Mr. Abernathy. He approached Gallo during the morning work assignment. "The boiler," Miller said, supplementing his limited vocabulary with gestures toward the steam-belching utility building. "Big problem." Gallo understood immediately. He nodded. Miller led him to the boiler room, where Abernathy stood staring at the shuddering machine, wiping grease from his hands with a rag in sheer frustration. The room was a cacophony of hissing steam and groaning metal. Gallo, followed by a wary Vico who had been assigned to assist, approached the boiler. He walked around it, listening, his head cocked like a doctor listening to a patient's breathing. He ran his hand gently over a vibrating pipe, feeling the rhythm of the machine's distress. Abernathy watched him, a mixture of skepticism and desperation on his face. Gallo pointed to a specific series of valves, then made a turning motion with his hand, followed by a gesture of removal and replacement. He then tapped a pressure gauge, his meaning clear. The primary regulators were failing in sequence. Abernathy's eyes widened slightly. He had suspected as much but had not been able to isolate the sequence. He nodded, conceding the diagnosis to the Italian sergeant. What followed was a remarkable collaboration that transcended language and rank. Miller stood guard, but his attention was on the work, his rifle forgotten for the moment. Abernathy, Gallo, and Vico became a single team, united against a common enemy of cold and failing machinery. Abernathy would point to a diagram in a technical manual. Gallo would study it, then tap the corresponding part on the boiler. Vico, quick and nimble, would be sent to fetch tools from the workshop. They communicated through the universal language of mechanics. The heft of a wrench, the specific torque needed to loosen a rusted bolt, the satisfying clang of a new valve being seated. At one point, Gallo needed to hold a superheated pipe steady while Abernathy worked to replace a seal. The foreman, seeing Gallo's hands were protected only by thin leather gloves, wordlessly handed him his own thick, insulated pair. It was a simple, practical gesture, a recognition of shared purpose and mutual risk. For hours they worked in the intense heat and noise of the boiler room. They were covered in grease and sweat. The lines of captor and captive, of American and Italian, blurred into the shared identity of men trying to fix a complex machine. They were no longer soldiers or prisoners. They were mechanics. Finally, the last valve was replaced. Gallo wiped his hands and gave Abernathy a questioning look. The foreman nodded. It was time. With a deep breath, Abernathy slowly opened the main steam valve. The initial hiss was sharp, then it settled into a low, powerful, and, most importantly, steady hum. The clanking was gone. The pressure gauges held firm. A wave of relief washed through the room. Abernathy broke into a wide grin and slapped Gallo on the back. A gesture of pure, unthinking camaraderie. "Damn good work, Sergeant," he said. The words irrelevant, the tone conveying everything. Gallo allowed himself a small, tired smile in return. Sergeant Miller, who had watched the entire process in silence, stepped forward. He looked at Gallo, then at the humming boiler. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of American cigarettes, shaking one out and offering it to the Italian sergeant. Gallo hesitated for a moment, then took it. Miller lit it for him with a Zippo, the small flame illuminating their faces in the dim light. They stood there for a moment, the American guard and the Italian prisoner, sharing a cigarette in the warmth of the newly repaired boiler room. The steady hum of the machine a testament to the human bridge they had just built. A bridge made not of words or sentiment, but of grease, steel, and a shared, practical competence. As the spring of 1945 arrived, bringing with it the scent of rain and new growth to the Texas plains, news of the war's end in Europe filtered into the camp. The atmosphere changed subtly. The routine remained the same, but it was now overlaid with a new tension, an undercurrent of anticipation and uncertainty. The war was over, but they were still here. What would happen to them now? The rumors began to fly, passed in whispers in the barracks and on work details. Repatriation. The word itself was a prayer. One morning, the announcement came. A list was posted on the administration building door. The first group of prisoners to be sent home had been selected. A crowd of men surged towards the board, their voices a low, anxious murmur. Gallo, Vico, and Benigni were there, their hearts pounding. Vico scanned the list, his finger tracing the names. Gallo, Benigni, we are there. We are on the list. A wave of joy and disbelief washed over them. They were going home. The reality of it was too immense to fully comprehend. They would see their families, their cities, their country again. The days leading up to their departure were a strange mix of celebration and formality. They were issued new, if ill-fitting, civilian clothes. They went through another medical examination, more thorough this time, and they had to sign papers, endless repatriation forms, their signatures the final act in the long, bureaucratic story of their captivity. Gallo sat at a trestle table, the same kind he had eaten at for over a year, and filled out the forms. Name, rank, date of capture, home address. The simple details of a life he was about to reclaim. He looked up and saw Captain Hayes, the medic, overseeing the process. The doctor gave him a small, professional nod of acknowledgement. On their last day, they were given a final meal in the mess hall. It was the same stew, the same bread, but it tasted different, charged with the significance of the moment. Gallo looked around at the faces of the men who were staying behind, their expressions a mixture of envy and hope for their own turn to come. He felt a pang of something he could not name. Not quite sadness, but a sense of an ending, a chapter closing. This place, which he had entered with such fear and dread, had become the entire world for him. Its rhythms, its rules, its strange, dispassionate humanity had shaped him. He was leaving not just a prison, but a life. As they were marched towards the main gate, where the same kind of canvas-covered trucks that had brought them were now waiting to take them away, Gallo saw a familiar figure standing near the guardhouse. It was Sergeant Miller. He was not on duty, he was simply watching. Their eyes met across the dusty compound. There was no animosity in Miller's gaze, no triumph. There was only a quiet, weary recognition. Gallo thought of the cigarette they had shared in the boiler room, the moment of shared victory over the failing machine. Felt like a lifetime ago. As he passed through the gate, leaving the wire behind him for the first time, he gave Miller a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The American sergeant returned it, a brief, final acknowledgement. It was not a farewell between friends, nor an exchange between enemies. It was a gesture of mutual, unspoken respect between two men who had occupied their roles with a certain weary professionalism. Two cogs in a vast machine of war who had briefly, improbably, managed to connect. The truck's engine rumbled to life, and as it pulled away, Gallo looked back one last time at the orderly lines of the barracks and the tall, silent watchtowers, now shrinking in the distance. The journey to the coast was long, the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels a constant accompaniment to Gallo's thoughts. He sat by a window, watching the American landscape slide by, vast, open, and indifferent. It was a country of immense scale, of endless plains giving way to rolling hills, of small, isolated farmhouses with their lights just beginning to shine against the encroaching dusk. The other men in the train car were boisterous, their relief and excitement spilling over into loud songs and laughter. They were already shedding the skin of the prisoner, eagerly anticipating the moment they would set foot on Italian soil. Vico was among them, his voice clear and happy as he sang a Neapolitan love song. Benigni sat quietly, a small, contented smile on his face, watching the changing light on the horizon as if committing it to memory for a future painting. Gallo did not join the singing. He remained a spectator, his mind still back in the camp, trying to assemble the pieces of his experience into a coherent whole. He felt a profound sense of paradox. He had been a prisoner of war, yet he had never been starved or beaten. He had been held by the enemy, yet he had encountered not monstrous ideologues, but tired foremen, efficient medics, and laconic guards. He had been stripped of his freedom, yet in the rigid structure of the camp, he had found a strange kind of order that had kept him whole. He had been prepared for a battle of wills, a struggle for survival against overt cruelty, but the challenge had been something far more subtle. It had been a struggle to understand, to reconcile the reality of his treatment with the certainties of his hatred. The Americans had defeated him not with force, but with procedure. They had dismantled his propaganda-fueled worldview not with speeches, but with clean towels, fair rations, and a projector beam cutting through the dark. As night fell completely, the train continued its relentless journey eastward. The celebrations in the car began to die down as exhaustion took over. Men slumped in their seats, their heads resting against the cool glass of the windows, their dreams now of home. The train passed through a small, sleeping town, its streets empty. Gallo watched the dark shapes of houses and trees flash by. Then, in the distance, set back from the tracks, he saw a single farmhouse. On its porch, a solitary lantern had been lit. It cast a small, steady circle of golden light, a fragile beacon against the immense, overwhelming darkness of the rural night. The light was not for him. It was not for anyone on the train. It was just there, a quiet, domestic symbol of endurance, a small flame holding its own against the vast emptiness. He watched it until it was just a pinprick, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The image remained burned into his mind. The quiet, unassuming glow, a symbol not of victory or freedom, but of a simple, persistent existence. It was like the lantern in the barracks, the steady hum of the repaired boiler, the warmth of the bread in the cold air. A small, tangible thing that held a meaning far greater than its form. The train rattled on through the night, carrying him home, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that a part of him would forever remain in that quiet, orderly, and incomprehensible place on the Texas plain.